Did you know that the story of the Exodus is not just about Israel's escape from Egypt, but a prophetic shadow of salvation for all humanity? Did you know that before the Red Sea parted, before the thunder at Sinai, the very first miracle was not about water or fire, but blood? The blood of the Lamb, painted on the wooden doorposts, forming the sign of protection. And did you know that this blood, shed in the night of Passover, pointed forward to another Lamb, the Lamb of God, whose blood would be placed on the wooden beams of a cross? This is not just history. This is not just a Jewish story. The Exodus is our story, the journey from bondage to freedom, from darkness to light, from death to life. It is the blueprint of salvation, written in smoke and fire, in bread and water, in law and covenant. And every step of the way, it whispers the name of the Messiah. Picture the land of Egypt. Golden temples glimmer in the sunlight. The Nile flows wide and proud. The palaces of Pharaoh rise with power and arrogance. But in the shadows, you hear the cries of a people enslaved. For over 400 years, the children of Israel groaned under harsh labor. They built cities not for themselves, but for the glory of Pharaoh. Their backs bent under whips, their hands blistered from clay and stone. Exodus 1 verses 13 to 14 tells us, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In the darkness of this suffering, a promise flickers. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land. But he would bring them out with great power, Genesis 15 verses 13 to 14. Now, that promise is about to unfold. God raises up Moses, once a prince in Pharaoh's house, now a shepherd in Midian. From the burning bush, the voice of the Eternal declares, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their crying. I have come down to rescue them, Exodus 3 verses 7 to 8. The plagues strike Egypt like blows from heaven, water to blood, frogs, locusts, darkness. Each plague is not random, it is God striking at the gods of Egypt, proving that Pharaoh's power is nothing. But the final plague is different. It is not just judgment, it is salvation. At midnight, the angel of death would pass through the land. The firstborn of every household would die. From the palace of Pharaoh to the prison cell, no house would be spared, except for those under the blood of the Lamb. God commands, take a lamb without blemish. Slaughter it. Put its blood on the doorframes of your houses. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt, Exodus 12 verses 5 to 13. Now imagine that night. Families gathered in fear and hope. Fathers dipping hyssop into bowls of blood, brushing it onto wooden beams. Mothers roasting lamb, preparing unleavened bread, packing hurried meals for a journey not yet begun. Children asking, why are we doing this? And parents whispering, because tonight, the Lord will save us. At midnight, the cries of Egypt rise like thunder. Every house without blood is struck with death. But among the homes marked by crimson, silence. Safety. Life. The Passover is not just a ritual. It is prophecy. Centuries later, John the Baptist would point to Jesus and declare, behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John 1 verse 29. And Paul would write, Christ, our Passover Lamb, has been sacrificed, 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. The wooden doorframes of Egypt foreshadowed the wooden cross of Calvary. The blood of lambs pointed to the blood of Christ. And just as death passed over Israel, so eternal judgment passes over all who are covered by his blood. The night of escape begins. The chains are broken. Pharaoh, defeated by grief and terror, drives the Israelites out. Go. Leave my people. Take your flocks and herds, and go. And bless me also. Exodus 12 verses 31 to 32. Imagine hundreds of thousands moving through the desert. Men, women, children, carrying baskets of unleavened bread on their backs. The elderly leaning on staffs. The young clutching treasures taken from Egypt, gold, silver, clothing, gifts from fearful neighbors. And above them, a mysterious presence, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, but Pharaoh's heart hardens once more. He gathers his chariots, the pride of Egypt, iron wheels thundering, horses pounding the earth. He sets out in pursuit. The Israelites look back, and terror floods them. In front of them, an endless sea. Behind them, the world's greatest army. They cry out, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the desert?" Exodus 14 verse 11. Fear blinds them. They forget the blood on the doorposts, the plagues, the power of God, but Moses stands firm. He raises his staff and declares, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." Exodus 14 verse 13. Then the impossible happens. The sea splits. Walls of water rise on the right and the left. The dry seabed opens like a highway through the deep. Imagine the roar of wind, the spray of salt on your face, the ground trembling as the people rush forward. Torches flicker, mothers clutch infants, children stare in wide-eyed wonder. A million footsteps echo between watery walls. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots plunge into the path. But the waters crash down with fury, swallowing the might of Egypt in a single moment. The sea that became salvation for Israel becomes destruction for their enemies. Centuries later, Paul would write, "Our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." 1 Corinthians 10 verses 1-2. The Red Sea is more than escape, it is transformation. The people who entered as slaves come out as free, and this too is a shadow of the cross. On the cross, Jesus passed through the deep waters of death. He bore the weight of our sin, and when he rose, he left sin, death, and hell buried like Pharaoh's army beneath the waves. When you are baptized, you walk the same path. The old life dies. The chains are broken. The waters close behind you. And you rise into freedom, not by your power, but by God's. The Red Sea is the gospel in water and wind. It is the story of every believer who has ever walked out of bondage and into freedom. The sea has closed. The bodies of Pharaoh's charioteers sink beneath the waves. On the far shore, Israel sings. Picture it, Miriam with a tambourine in her hand, women dancing, voices crying out, "The Lord is my strength and my defense, he has become my salvation." Exodus 15 verse 2. But joy in the desert fades quickly. 3 days pass. The sun burns mercilessly, sand stretches in every direction, and there is no water. Children cry with dry lips. Cattle stumble in exhaustion. At last, they find a spring, but the water is bitter, undrinkable. The people grumble, "What are we to drink?" Exodus 15 verse 24. Moses cries out to God, who shows him a piece of wood. He throws it into the water. And it becomes sweet. Even here, God is teaching them, in the desert of life, when bitterness overwhelms, his provision can turn death into life. Soon, hunger gnaws at them. The desert is barren, the people restless. They cry, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted." Exodus 16 verse 3. They long for slavery rather than trust, but God answers not with wrath, but with bread. In the morning, as the dew lifts, the ground sparkles with something white and fine, like frost. The Israelites stare in wonder, "What is it?" In Hebrew, manna. Moses declares, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Exodus 16 verse 15. Each family gathers just enough for the day. No more, no less. If they hoard, it rots. If they trust, it satisfies. Imagine waking each morning to find heaven's provision waiting outside your tent. Day after day, for 40 years, manna falls. Ordinary yet miraculous. Simple yet sacred. Centuries later, Jesus would stand before another crowd in the wilderness. After feeding them with loaves and fish, he declares, "Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the bread of life, John 6 verses 49 to 51. The manna was never just food, it was prophecy. It pointed to the true bread from heaven, Jesus Christ, who alone satisfies the hunger of the soul, but the story is not finished. Again, the people thirst. At Rephidim, their voices rise in anger. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Exodus 17 verse 3. Stones lie scattered at Moses' feet, and he fears they may kill him. God commands, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. Exodus 17 verse 6. Moses raises his staff, strikes the stone, and suddenly the desert erupts with streams of water. Imagine the shock, dusty mouths now drenched, parched throats singing again. From lifeless rock, rivers flow. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4, they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Think of that. The rock split open in the desert was not just stone, it was a shadow of the Messiah, struck for our sake, pouring out living water. And years later, Jesus would stand in Jerusalem and cry out, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, rivers of living water will flow from within them. John 7 verses 37 to 38. The manna and the rock tell the same story. In the wilderness of life, God Himself is our sustenance. Bread for the hungry. Water for the thirsty. Grace for the undeserving. Christ is both, the bread of life and the living water. So pause for a moment. Imagine yourself among that crowd in the desert. Each dawn, gathering manna with trembling hands. Each evening, drinking from a stream that should not exist. Every day, learning the same truth, freedom is not the end of the story, dependence is. The God who saves is also the God who sustains. The desert journey leads them south. Days turn into weeks. The cloud moves before them by day, the fire burns by night. And then, at last, they come to the mountain of God, Sinai. Its peaks rise stark and jagged against the desert sky. This is the place where Moses first saw the burning bush. Now, the entire nation stands at its base. Picture the scene, tents spread across the plain, children chasing each other in the dust, families cooking over small fires. But above them looms a mountain wrapped in mystery. On the third day, the air changes. Thunder shakes the ground. Lightning cracks across the sky. A dense cloud descends on the summit, and the blast of a trumpet grows louder and louder. Exodus 19 verse 16 says, everyone in the camp trembled. Moses leads the people out to meet God. Can you imagine it? The very Creator descending in fire. The mountain smokes like a furnace. The ground trembles violently. And a voice, unlike any voice ever heard, echoes through the valley, the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Exodus 20 verses 2 to 3, the words carve themselves not only into stone, but into the hearts of the people. Command after command unfolds, no idols, no misuse of His name, honor the Sabbath, honor your parents, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal. Do not lie, do not covet. This is not just law, it is covenant. The God who redeemed them now defines the relationship. He rescued them not to wander aimlessly, but to live as His chosen people, a holy nation. Freedom is not license, freedom is a calling, but there is fear. The people tremble, begging Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us or we will die. Exodus 20 verse 19. The holiness of God exposes the weakness of man. Sinai is overwhelming, majestic, terrifying, untouchable. Here lies the paradox. The law is perfect, but people are not. The commandments shine like blazing light, but they also reveal shadows in every heart. As Paul would later write, through the law we become conscious of our sin, Romans 3 verse 20. Sinai does not save, Sinai shows the need for salvation, and yet, even in this, Christ is foreshadowed. Just as Moses stood as mediator between God and the people, so Jesus stands as our mediator of a new covenant. The letter to the Hebrews declares, "You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God." Hebrews 12 verses 18 and 22. Imagine it. At Sinai, the people stood trembling at a distance. At Calvary, the Son of God drew near, taking the law's curse upon himself. At Sinai, the mountain burned with fire. At Pentecost, fire descended not on a mountain, but on people, on ordinary men and women filled with the Holy Spirit. The covenant of Sinai carved law into stone. The covenant of Christ carves love into hearts, but that day, Israel made their vow. With one voice they answered, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Exodus 24 verse 3. Blood was sprinkled on the altar and on the people, sealing the covenant. They belonged to God, not as slaves but as his treasured possession, and from the mountaintop, Moses received not only commandments but instructions for a dwelling place, the tabernacle, a sanctuary where God would live among them. The Holy One who thundered from the peak would dwell in their midst. Grace hidden in fire. Presence hidden in a tent. The journey of Exodus is no longer just escape. It is transformation. From Egypt's chains to Sinai's covenant, God is shaping a people for himself. From Sinai, the journey continues. The trumpet blasts fade, the mountain smoke drifts away, and once again the endless desert stretches before them. The people have heard the voice of God, they have pledged their obedience, and yet, only days later, their hearts begin to wander. Picture the camp. Thousands of tents scattered across the wilderness, dust swirling in the heat, the steady rhythm of marching feet. But instead of songs of deliverance, a murmur spreads, grumbling. They long for Egypt again, the food, the routine, even the chains. They say to Moses, "Why did we ever leave Egypt?" Numbers 11:20. This is the paradox of freedom. You can walk out of Egypt in a single night. But it may take a lifetime to walk Egypt out of your heart. The most shocking moment comes at Sinai's very foot. While Moses is on the mountain receiving the law, the people grow restless. They gather around Aaron and demand, "Make us gods who will go before us." Exodus 32 verse 1. Out of their gold, they fashion a calf, and they bow to it, declaring, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Can you hear the betrayal? The very people who walked through parted seas now kneel before metal. Fire still smolders on Sinai's summit, yet their hearts are cold. Moses descends with the stone tablets in his hands. His face burns with righteous anger. He shatters the tablets at the foot of the mountain. A symbol of a covenant already broken. Judgment falls, 3,000 perish by the sword that day. The air is heavy with shame and silence. And yet, here, grace speaks. Moses pleads with God, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." Exodus 33 verse 15. God answers, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Exodus 33 verse 14. Even in failure, God does not abandon his people. He renews the covenant. New tablets are carved. The cloud once again descends. His glory passes by Moses, who hears the most breathtaking words, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." Exodus 34 verse 6. Imagine that. A God who should have destroyed them instead reveals himself as merciful, gracious, patient, abounding in love. This is the heartbeat of the wilderness, judgment and mercy. Rebellion and grace. The years stretch on. Day after day, manna falls. Night after night, the fire burns. Their clothes do not wear out. Their sandals do not break. Deuteronomy 29 verse 5. Even in discipline, God sustains, but the wilderness is more than geography, it is a classroom. Here, they learn dependence. Here, they learn trust. Here, idols are exposed, and hearts are tested. Centuries later, Jesus himself would walk into the wilderness for 40 days, facing temptation. Where Israel grumbled, he trusted. Where they failed, he triumphed. And in his victory, he showed that grace is greater than rebellion. Have you ever felt like you were wandering in a wilderness season? Lost. Restless, uncertain. The story of Israel tells us this: God does not waste deserts. Even in dry places, His presence sustains. Even in failure, His grace abounds. The wilderness is not the end. It is preparation. In the heart of the desert, God gives instructions not just for survival, but for relationship. He commands Moses to build a sanctuary, a place where the Eternal will dwell among His people, Exodus 25 verse 8. Not on Sinai's distant peak, not hidden in thunder and fire, but right in the center of the camp, at the core of this sanctuary lies the most sacred object, the Ark of the Covenant. Picture it, a chest of acacia wood, overlaid with pure gold. Inside are the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, Hebrews 9 verse 4. On top, the mercy seat, with two golden cherubim facing one another, wings outstretched, covering the throne of God's presence. This is no mere artifact. This is the throne of the invisible King, the place where heaven and earth meet. Between the wings of the cherubim, the glory of God descends in a blazing cloud. Exodus 25 verse 22 declares, "There, above the cover between the two cherubim, I will meet with you and give you all my commands." Imagine standing in the camp of Israel. By night, the fire glows above the tabernacle. By day, a pillar of cloud rises into the sky. Every Israelite can look and see, God is here. Not far, not silent, but present. The same God who split seas now rests in their midst. Wherever the cloud moves, the camp moves. Wherever it settles, they settle. The ark leads them into battle, parts rivers, and topples walls. It is the beating heart of Israel's faith, the visible sign of an invisible presence. But there is mystery. Only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, may the high priest enter the most holy place, carrying blood to sprinkle on the mercy seat. Without blood, there is no access. Without sacrifice, there is no communion. The ark reminds them, God is near, but He is holy. His presence is life, but His holiness is fire, and yet, even here, Christ is hidden. The mercy seat foreshadows the cross, where blood is poured out not once a year, but once for all. Paul writes in Romans 3 verse 25, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement, through the shedding of His blood, to be received by faith. The ark carried manna. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. The ark carried the law. Jesus says, I have fulfilled the law. The ark carried Aaron's rod of priesthood. Jesus is the great high priest who never dies. Every item inside the ark points forward to Him. Every ritual, every sacrifice whispers His name. Today, we no longer look to a golden chest hidden in a tent. Paul declares, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? 1 Corinthians 3 verse 16. Through Christ, the presence that once rested above the ark now rests within us. Think of that, the same glory that shook Sinai, the same fire that hovered above the tabernacle, now abides in the hearts of believers. The Exodus story does not end with a box in the desert, it ends with God's presence filling His people forever. So when you feel alone, when you wonder if God has abandoned you, remember the Arkansas, remember the mercy seat. Remember the blood. And know this, the God of Exodus is still the God who dwells with His people today. The story of Exodus is not just Israel's story, it is ours. The blood of the Lamb on wooden doorframes points us to the blood of Christ on the cross. The path through the Red Sea shows us baptism, where the old life is buried and a new one begins. The manna and the water from the rock remind us that only Christ can satisfy our deepest hunger and thirst. The law at Sinai reveals our sin, but also our need for a Savior. The Ark of the Covenant, shimmering with glory, whispers of a greater presence, that God Himself would dwell with us, and in us, through His Spirit, from slavery to freedom. From fear to faith. From wilderness to promise. The Exodus is not ancient history, it is a map of redemption. And every step of the journey traces the outline of a cross, so the question is not, did Israel walk through the sea? The question is, will you? Will you let the blood of the Lamb cover you? Will you step into the waters and leave the chains of Egypt behind? Will you trust the bread of life and drink from the living water? Will you follow the cloud and the fire, wherever he leads? This is not just their story. It can be your story. If you are searching for freedom, hope, and purpose, the God of Exodus is still calling today. The same God who said to Moses, "I have come down to rescue my people," has come down in Jesus Christ to rescue you. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe to this channel for more journeys through the Bible, stories that connect past to present, history to eternity. And as always, stay with us as we uncover the greatest story ever told, step by step, page by page. From Egypt's shadows to Sinai's fire, from wilderness wandering to promised hope, the God who delivered then still delivers now. And the Exodus continues in you.